Okay, now this course is going to get good. We have finished our discussion of the most famous of Machiavelli's works, The Prince, a work that I assume all of you know something about. I'm sure many of you have read, probably in its entirety, perhaps in a Western Civ course or a history course or political science course. You've certainly read snippets of it. It's well known, oft-quoted, oft-misquoted, often understood, often misunderstood. But what I want to argue is that Machiavelli's most thoughtful and most profound work, and a work that's had a great deal of influence, although not to the extent of The Prince, is his discourses on the first 10 books of Livy. And we're going to spend this lecture learning a little bit about Livy and the Roman Republic, and then the 7 following lectures discussing this important book of Machiavelli's. And my goal is to persuade you, even if you have not heard of and almost certainly not read all of the discourses, to go out and get it and to spend some time with it and to ruminate on it. And I think you will find it will repay the time that you invest in reading this very thoughtful, carefully conceived book by Niccolo Machiavelli. Well, if I'm right, if it is such a good book, why doesn't everybody read it? Why is it a kind of secret, if you will, from many people who know the name Machiavelli or have read something of Machiavelli? Let me suggest 2, I think, fairly obvious reasons. Number 1, it's pretty long. Much longer, 3, 4, 5 times longer, perhaps even, than The Prince. Of course, what that means is that, let's be practical about this, most people who read Machiavelli in college. And if you're going to read a work of Machiavelli's, you're going to read the most famous one, and one that's short, because there is some advantage of teaching a whole work rather than little snippets. And so the very length of the discourses that Machiavelli wrote work against it being nearly as well known as The Prince. Secondly, it is a series of discourses, 3 long discourses subdivided each into many chapters, on the first 10 books of Livy. Well, wherever you are, in your car or in your living room, put up your hand if you've read the first 10 books of Livy. I'm just imagining now, but I don't think I see very many hands. This is the first 5 books of Livy, so multiply by 2, and you see that Livy, first 10 books, which tell the story from the founding of Rome until the year 293 BC, or BCE, depending on how you date things, those first 10 books are very long. They have a lot of names. It's a chronological approach to early Roman history. And even if you took a course in Roman history in college, it's unlikely that you read more than a small snippet of Livy, if you read any at all. Livy is one of those authors, sort of like Cicero, who in the 20th century probably began to have a reputation that declined. Actually, his began to decline in the 18th century, rightly or wrongly. And so, therefore, the discourses is hard to read if you don't know what Machiavelli is discoursing on. And so those 2 things, the length and the fact that he's writing based on Livy, conspire together, if you will, although unconsciously, to keep many people from tackling this most important work of Machiavelli. Let's turn for most of this lecture to a look at Livy and get to know Livy and the subject of Livy's history of Rome. First of all, Livy, of course, wrote in Latin. He was a Roman, lived at the time of Augustus. In fact, to be precise, he was born in 64, we think, BC, and he died in 17 AD, so that he lived through the reign of the Emperor Augustus as the Republic was coming to an end. Okay, that's who Livy was. But because Livy wrote in Latin, his writings, those that have been preserved, I'll explain in a minute that not all of Livy's history survives, but those parts that we have today, of course, were copied during the Middle Ages and read some. Not a lot, but some. Livy was not unknown. Dante, in fact, pays Livy a high compliment, writing just after 1300. He refers to Livy as that historian who does not err, who does not make mistakes. But during the Renaissance, Livy became the historian for the humanists in Florence. Because as we saw, one of the important parts of the humanist movement was we go back and learn about the ancient past, and it becomes a way of us understanding ourselves and living better. Well, I've already set up this equation, but let me remind you. Rome was a republic. Florence is a republic in Machiavelli's time as he serves the Republican government of Florence. And even during the eras of Medici rule, the propaganda always was that, the Medici are first citizens and it really is a republic still, even though the Medici were in charge. So you've got a republic in Rome written about primarily by Livy. And you've got this republic in Florence. Well, of course, Livy has something to say to that society. And so Livy became enormously popular. As I pointed out, Machiavelli had in his home as a boy a copy of Livy, a printed copy, not a manuscript copy, that his father obtained by doing the index. He was paid for doing the index by getting a copy of the book. Again, early printed books were still quite expensive. It wasn't until early in the 16th century, and probably more in Germany than Italy, that the value of the printing press as a way of widely distributing materials to people who could have never afforded hand-copied books was understood. So we have, therefore, this great popularity of Livy during the Renaissance. Livy came from what's now called the city of Padua, or Padova in Italian, in the northern part of Italy. He did a lot of his writing while living in Padua, and then came to Rome and caught the attention of and became an acquaintance of the Emperor Augustus. However, he was never part of Augustus's inner circle. He was never one of Augustus's major advisors. He didn't write on commission from Augustus. In fact, it's interesting, he apparently never held any office at all, something we might expect him to have done. Furthermore, although we know almost nothing about his life other than what we can glean from what he wrote about Roman history, it appears he was never a soldier because, as military historians have pointed out, he makes a lot of mistakes when describing military matters, and so people assume he did not have much experience as a soldier. Livy wrote 142 what are then called books, more accurately scrolls, of Roman history. 142 of them, beginning with the foundation of Rome, that is to say, all that Romulus and Remus stuff. We'll talk about it, and Machiavelli will talk about it indeed. Of those 142 books of history that he wrote, only 35 still exist. Most of Livy is gone. Is there any hope we'll someday find it? Not much. It was gone, obviously, already in Machiavelli's time. We don't think there are any manuscripts that we're likely to discover in a musty old library somewhere that, alas, have all of Livy's history. If we were to take all 142 books of Livy's history and print it in modern editions, like the first 5 books here, Livy wrote about 9,000 modern pages of Roman history. I want you to think about that. 9,000 pages. Now, if we think about an average book size today as being 300 pages, okay? I want you to think about how many books Livy wrote. It was an enormous undertaking. We do know what was in the missing books with a couple exceptions because later writers did write summaries of each of the books of Livy. We can conclude simply from the amount of stuff. I mean, again, this is 5 books. He wrote 142 books. Imagine, if you will, that you've got one of these volumes that say 3/4 of an inch in front of you containing the first 5 books, and then multiply that. Remember, he wrote 142 books, and you know that Livy was a shelf of Roman history in modern print. We don't think, however, that Livy did what we would call archival research. He could have. There were a lot of documents. There were a lot of records. There were a lot of lists that survived in ancient Rome. Not all the way back to the time of Romulus and Remus, but back several hundred years. There's no reason to think, from what Livy tells us in his history, that in fact Livy did any of that sort of research at all. What he seems to have done is relied on the writings of earlier Roman historians, so that almost all of what he writes, until he gets to close to his own time, is filtered through earlier historians and probably still contains a good deal of oral tradition, some of which had been written down and some of which was still in oral form. So we don't think of Livy as a researcher. We think of him as a writer of history. Now that sounds odd to us today because, especially for academic historians like myself, it seems that the two, researcher and historian, go hand in hand. And in fact, it's very easy for modern historians to criticize Livy for not doing what we would have done, or what we think we would have done, had we lived in his era, knowing that there were documents to look at. But we need to remember who Livy was and who Livy wasn't. Now, of these 142 books, one of the interesting questions is, what survives? Which 35 books of the 142 survive? What do they cover? And let me suggest there are two big chunks, a very early chunk, and then a chunk that begins in the 3rd century and goes into the 2nd century. I'm going to go over both of these in more details, the first more than the second, because the first is the part from which Machiavelli draws his examples in his discourses. Let's look at those first 10 books. Book 1 is the legendary beginnings of Rome. Again, Romulus and Remus, and tells the story. The traditional founding date of Rome was 753 BC. Those things cannot be confirmed, at least at that level of specificity, by historians today. And Book 1 carries the story down to 509, the traditional date of the founding of the Roman Republic. The great event that founds the Roman Republic is that a guy named Brutus, obviously this is almost 500 years before the more famous Brutus, but Brutus carries out the expulsion of the last of the Roman kings, and therefore that's the date that marks the founding of the Republic. So Book 1 covers this period from the founding through the kings to the establishment of the Republic. Books 2 through 5 carry that story down through the year 390 BC, when Rome is besieged by and briefly taken by a tribe from the north called the Gauls. This was an important dividing line in Roman history. And by the way, it remained so for a long time because it was the last time that the city of Rome was actually taken. Hannibal might have been able to, but he didn't. The last time Rome was taken in 800 years. The next time is 410 AD, when the Goths come and for several days sack the city of Rome. We need to understand that's why people in 410 AD were so shocked, because it hadn't been done in 800 years. It hadn't been done since 390. So books 1 through 5 start with the founding of Rome by Romulus and go down to the year 390. And then the next 5 books, so that we remember that this is the discourse on the first 10 books of Livy, books 6 through 10 carry the story to the year 293 BC. And they are largely the story, those 6 through 10, largely the story of Rome's beginning to expand in Italy. Sometimes we refer to these books as the conquest of Italy, but we need to remember that it was really the conquest of much of central Italy. For example, Sicily didn't come under Roman domination for a long time, and the area up now where Milan is and the foothills of the Alps and so on, that didn't come into Roman control until several centuries later. So we're looking at, though, the first expansion. Rome was essentially a town on the Tiber that didn't control much beyond what we think of as the city of Rome today. By 293, it had conquered a fair chunk of Italy. So these are the stories the stories from Romulus and Remus down to 293 that Machiavelli will somewhat systematically retell, draw lessons from, and make comparisons with to modern events in the discourses. And therefore, if you want to do some preliminary reading for Machiavelli's discourses, assignment A is go read the first 10 books of Livy. If you don't have time to do that, at least read some sort of organized narrative summary of Roman history for that period so you know what it is that Machiavelli is drawing from. That would be a very useful thing to do. Now, beginning after book 10, there's a gap. The next books are lost, and we get the second chunk of Livy. I simply want to point this out fairly briefly, beginning with the Punic Wars, the war between Rome and Carthage. All the stories you know probably of Hannibal crossing the Alps and all that stuff with elephants and all those Hannibal stories are preserved for us by Livy. Again, he got them out of older histories, but those older histories, by and large, don't survive. And so, therefore, we rely on Livy for this great story of the struggle between Rome and Carthage. And the next chunk of Machiavelli, this starts with the Punic, of Livy, this starts with the Punic Wars, that continues till about the year 150, by which time Rome has conquered parts of North Africa and much of the Greek-speaking world. And then the more modern history of the Roman Republic, from 146 or so on, all of that's gone. We don't have any of that from Livy, although we have other sources for it, of course. So you'll notice that although the discourses are based on the first 10 books of Livy, you can tell from the extended example he gives of Hannibal in The Prince that Machiavelli knows the rest of Livy and not just these 10 books. Now, the first 10 books contain most of the stories that you probably know about early Roman history. First of all, of course, they contain, as I said, the story of Romulus and Remus. And that's always good. I mean, that comes with She-Wolf, that comes with brother murdering brother. Romulus kills Remus. And by the way, Machiavelli is going to have a lot to say about whether that was an okay thing to do. An interesting question in and of itself. The first 10 books, as I said, contain the story of Brutus expelling the last king, Tarquin the Proud, and therefore ushering in the establishment of the Republic. And then there are all those good heroic tales of good old virtuous Roman Republicans, some of which you might know. Horatius standing by himself to defend a bridge until it could be destroyed so that Rome could not be conquered. And the famous story of Cincinnatus being called to leave his plow and go out and lead Rome to victory. Those are also stories in the first 10 books of Livy, stories again that Machiavelli will comment on. The Cincinnatus story, of course, is very important even in American history. After all, if you look at the statue of 1775 of the Minutemen at Lexington and Concord, what do you discover? They are men leaving their plow. Well, of course, they were literally leaving their plow, but also it identifies them with that virtue and that sort of citizen soldier notion of the ancient Roman Republic. It is no accident that George Washington named the Veterans Organization at the end of the American Revolution the Order of the Cincinnati, which is simply plural of Cincinnatus. We're a nation of Cincinnatuses, if you will. Those are the guys that won the freedom of the states from Britain. And so those are stories that are passed down directly or indirectly to us. They are all found in their oldest form that survives in Livy. Now, let me suggest, I've already mentioned this, that modern historical writers have not been all that kind to Livy. I pointed out one reason. Livy could have done some archival research, although it's doubtful he could have written 142 scrolls if he'd done so. He could have done archival research, but he didn't. And you can imagine academic historians tend to sort of shudder a bit at that. Secondly, if we were asked who is the hero of Livy's history of the Roman Republic, the answer is Rome is the hero, and providentially so. It just seems to have been in the cards that Rome was going to succeed. And that's a kind of interpretation that modern historians are uncomfortable with. We don't tend to write about things happening providentially. Furthermore, very much in tune with the historiographical traditions of his own time, Livy was unapologetic in trying to say, here are good guys and bad guys. Here are lessons to imitate. Here are lessons to run away from. He is a moralist, and he believes that in many ways the value of history is teaching right and wrong. It's a very moral approach to history. What do we learn from history? We learn how to act well and what the consequences are, how to act badly and what the consequences are. By the way, although I think we can say in general, Machiavelli agrees with the notion that what we want to do is draw some very practical lessons from the past, not just treat it for its own sake. Nevertheless, Machiavelli will not be afraid to criticize Livy as wrong or naive. His respect for Livy is great. That does not mean, certainly, that Livy is infallible. By the way, I just want to point out parenthetically that this notion of history as a moral undertaking is very important and was up till the 19th century when a kind of science or social science model of history was created, first by the Germans, and then later on it came to the United States and the rest of the world. And if you read other early Roman historians, by the way, I particularly recommend the Roman historian Sallust, who wrote 2 short works that are very interesting, you will see that once again they are openly, obviously, and directly designed to be part of the literature of morality. They are about how people should act and what happens when people act badly. Why was Machiavelli so attracted to Livy and his History of the Roman Republic? Well, again, Machiavelli is a Florentine living in a republic, and I've already talked about that in general. But let me suggest something that's a bit more specific. If we look at the Roman Republic, here is a way to describe it. It lasted a very long time. If we just use the traditional dates, and historians can fiddle with them on either end, and rightfully so, that's an okay thing for historians to do. We do a lot of fiddling. You begin in 509 BC, and you usually give as the date of the end of the Republic 27 BC, when Augustus sort of declares himself as, well, Augustus. It's a title, after all, not a name. Well, 509 to 27, you don't have to be a wizard to know that's about 500 years. The Republic lasted a long time. It didn't last forever, but it lasted a very long time. And that in itself says, they must be doing something right. Secondly, when the Republic began, it was a dot on the map. It was what we would call the town or city of Rome, and not much else. By the time the Republic ended, it controlled virtually the entire Mediterranean, some of what we would call the Middle East, all of what we would call Spain and France or Gaul. It was very big, very wealthy, and very powerful. You got to respect that. Again, you got to say they did something right for a very long time. If you simply gauge the Roman Republic by its success, its stability, and its growth, you got to say, by gum, there are going to be some lessons here that we can learn from those folks way back then. And so we can understand why Machiavelli, not just as someone who was given a humanist education or someone whose dad happened to have a copy of Livy, but if we remember the subject matter of Livy's history, we can see why Machiavelli was so impressed. And we need to remember that, therefore, Machiavelli respects Livy as a historian and is extraordinarily interested in the subject of Livy's history. You know, sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other. I've had students say to me, I take your courses, but I'm not very interested in what you teach. I just sort of, enjoy your lectures or whatever it might be. By the way, that's not nearly as flattering as I think it is. I want them to love the stuff I teach. They like the historian, they don't like the subject matter. Other times you find that students like the subject matter, but they don't like your approach to it. I'll teach a course in the Middle Ages and students will be disappointed because I don't teach them how to make chainmail or how to build a catapult. and therefore they're interested in the subject matter of the Middle Ages, but they're not interested in what I have to say about it. Well, Machiavelli was interested in Livy as a writer and thinker, and also the subject of Livy's great book, that is to say, the ancient Roman Republic. Machiavelli admired the fact that Livy was not what we might call today an antiquarian. He was not really writing history for its own sake, but for what it can teach us about how we should behave, how we should act, how we can understand the world we live in today better. History was a guide, sometimes a warning, for us today, not simply an obscure intellectual enterprise. And Machiavelli enriches Livy because even though this book we're going to be looking at is indeed based on the first 10 books of Livy, Machiavelli, as he did in The Prince, throws in lots of contemporary examples. He'll draw some point from Livy and say, the best example of that, and then he'll tell something that happened 3 days ago. He does in one case, by the way, literally do that. Say, here's something that happened just a few days ago. Helps us date when he wrote the discourses. So Machiavelli is going to continue that process of not simply reporting about the ancient past, but also giving modern analogs, modern illustrations of points that Livy makes when he finds those to be the most useful. Now, this is a book that exposes Machiavelli as a, obviously small r, I won't keep saying that, a small r Republican. That you might not get that. Some readers today say, you know, I can sort of see that in The Prince. It isn't right there in the open. He isn't saying it out loud, but I sort of get that. Maybe so. Maybe if we only had The Prince, there would be those who would read it and say, you know, this guy's really a Republican at heart. But probably not many. But Machiavelli is openly, clearly someone who prefers Republican government. There's no secret about that as we read the discourses. And therefore, I want to end this introductory lecture by saying, what does Machiavelli mean by the word republic? We use it a lot. We take a pledge of allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands. And we use that word a great deal. I ask students very often, give me a quick definition of republic, and their answer very often is, a republic is a representative democracy. Bag that one. That will not do. That's not what Machiavelli means at all. Beginning with Aristotle, a definition of a republic emerges in the ancient world, and it's one that Machiavelli is going to use. It takes its clearest form, not from Aristotle, but from a 2nd century, listen to this, 2nd century BC Greek historian writing in the Greek language, but writing in Rome about Roman history, named Polybius. And this is basically how Aristotle, and even more so Polybius, understand a republic. Okay, you can be governed in 3 ways. You can be governed by one, you can be governed by few, or you can be governed by many. We might today say monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. The problem is that none of those is very stable. That monarchy can turn into tyranny, aristocracy can turn into something like oligarchy, government by the wealthy rather than government by the best, which is what aristocracy, after all, means in its original Greek, and democracy can turn into mob rule. So all of these are fairly unstable forms of government. A republic is a mixed constitution. It has elements of monarchy, elements of aristocracy, and elements of a democracy. And using a combination of those 3 basic forms, government by one, government by few, and government by many, a good republic is stable. By the way, think how important that is to Machiavelli. He lost his job in Florence when the government changed from being a true republic, he believed, to the Medici coming in and ruling. Think of all the general instability in Italy. What you need is something that lasts, something that's stable, something that is strong enough institutionally and conceptually to survive all the inevitable challenges and changes of fortune or human action that take place. And so Machiavelli comes to look at Rome as a republic, he sees its constitution, he sees its longevity, he sees its successes. And therefore, it really is the most appropriate and useful thing that Machiavelli can study and present to those whom he hopes will liberate Italy and restore Italy to peace and stability.